Hello, my name is Doña Mariana Ruiz de Medina, and welcome to Exploring Late Iberian Court Cuisine and Ruperto de Nola's Libro de guisados, manjares y potajes. A little bit of background on me. I've been playing in the SCA for about 5 years now in the Kingdom of Atlantia, and my major area of interest and study is in 15th and 16th century Spain, with a lot of emphasis on food history. Mundanely, I work in the sustainable agriculture industry and have been working in sustainable and high end food for about 15 years now. In this class, we're going to be covering both the history and influences in the Libro, as well as discussing the recipes themselves. We'll talk about the author, his style of writing, the ingredients, and some of the redactions I have done over the years. So, first up, the book itself. The Libro that we know is so much more than just a cookbook. What we mundanely understand as a cookbook is very much the evolution of a few different things. First is books of household management, where what we would consider the cookbook is really just a chapter in a much larger manual. The Libro is an excellent example of that. Not included in the translation that we have available to us are sections on doing laundry, staffing the royal household, running certain types of events, taking care of your dishes, and what sort of dishware you use for what, as well as a chapter on butchering and carving. The second is the origin of the commonplace book, which is a tool of education popularized by the humanist movement for both men and women. These books would be filled with a variety of notes, including recipes, and were often printed and published. Over time, these recipes, or receipts, would become their own standalone published book, especially with the advent of printing. The translation that we have was done by Acadian, and I entirely credit her with the incredible work she's done on this. It was originally published in the Florilegium and contains an extensive amount of footnotes, relationships to other cookbooks at the time, which we will talk about a little bit later, as well as some invaluable insights on ingredients, weights and measures. I do have a Google Doc of her work with the footnotes tied back to their original placed in the text that is included in the handout with this class. The next thing to consider is food as medicine. Humoral theory was still very much prevalent at the time of this book's writing, and there is a not insignificant mention of recipes, particularly in the meat days section, that call out how to make it more palatable or digestible for someone who is ill. Some will reference specific ailments or even include "for an invalid" in the title. These influences would also have played a role in how dishes were paired together. The major takeaway should be that this book is not a book about banquets and parties, which is a major difference in a lot of its source material. Much of the information we have on the book and its direct culinary heritage is from the Libro de Saint-Sauvy, which is very much all about the party. But the Libro de Guisados is about the day-to-day running of a household, specifically the royal household of Naples. We may know a lot about the book, but the author, however, we do not know a lot about at all. Things we do know. We know where he cooked. The name Nola is a reference to the city of Naples, which was at the time a dependent of the Crown of Aragon. We also know many of his notable culinary influences. We'll see more of this when we discuss the timeline of the book, but there is also a non-trivial amount of plagiarism in this book. Outright stealing from other intellectual property sources was rampant at the time. It was expected. There are several things in this book straight up copied from other similar books, and other things that are definitely paraphrased or heavily influenced by other sources. We have a very good idea of the agricultural and economic influences in both Spain and Naples at the time, which brings us to the ingredient availability. Spain has a long and storied history as an agricultural and trade hub, and that plays a big part in how many of the recipes in this book are constructed. Things we don't know. We don't know when he cooked. We don't know when he was employed. We don't know when he was born, when he died. We don't actually know much of anything about the author as a person outside of his name. There are a few theories tied to the publications of the book itself. The earliest copy we have is published in Catalana, and this poses a couple of logistical questions. Was the author Catalan, living in Naples with the court? Was he born to Catalan parents in Naples? Was he Napolitano and just adapting to the ways and language of his employer? We just have no idea. However, we do have one big clue, which lies in the attribution of this book, but frankly, even that is a little unclear. Which brings us to the dedication itself. The Libro de Guisados is dedicated to an otherwise unidentifiable King Ferrando, or El Rey Ferrando. There are three possibilities within a reasonable time period of when this book was published that it could be. Fernando I spent most time of the three options in Naples. He also had the longest lasting reign of the three as well. The end of his reign is slightly before our copy of the book's publication, but not so much so before that it is unreasonable that he could be the Fernando referenced. Fernando II, on the other hand, is a much less likely option. He is the son of Fernando I, but only ruled for a short period of time and did not identify with his Catalan and Spanish heritage. He viewed himself very much as Napolitano, and would likely have had his table set much more in an Italian or Sicilian fashion. Last but not least is Fernando el Católico of Ferdinand and Isabella fame. He ruled much closer to the publication of our book. However, he did not start spending an overwhelming amount of his time in Naples until his daughter Juana took the throne of Spain and he acted as her regent there. Knowing all of this, most scholars generally believe that Nola worked under Fernando I. The first known edition of this book was published in 1520 in Barcelona as the Libro del Coch. It is highly unlikely that this is the true first publication of the book, merely just the first we happen to have. It was published in Catalana, which ties in with the Aragonese crown in Naples at the time, and again brings into question when and where the author originated. The first version in Castellano, or what we know today as Spanish, was published in 1525 and followed by 10 other publications, including the one used for this class. The version this class looks at was published in 1529, also in Castellano. And then in 1599, we have a very similar cookbook published by a different author, Diego Granada, in Castellano, that is effectively word for word plagiarized from Nola's work. And again, as we discussed before, this is not a new thing. Nola ripped some of his work straight from out of Saint-Sauvy when he needed to, but the concept of plagiarism, instead of just information sharing, would come into play as printing grew in popularity and accessibility and easy attribution of authorship was much more viable. Now we're going to get into the agricultural history of Spain. Spain has been agriculturally important since the days of the Roman Empire, where it was referred to as the breadbasket of Rome. There are a few agricultural concepts that were really tested in Spain under Rome, but knowing that Spain has been kind of on the front lines of agriculture for most of its history plays a big role in the kinds of food and food culture we see developing. We can't talk about food without discussing climate. Without wanting to overgeneralize too much, the best way to think about the climate in Spain is California, but before California was constantly on fire. If you can think of something you'd like to grow, odds are you can grow it somewhere in Spain. There are 5 major climate zones in Spain, but the majority of the country is Mediterranean or Mediterranean coastal. What this means is warm, dry summers and mild winters that generally don't reach extreme temperatures. This is particularly important for produce and grain growing. Where I live in Atlantia, just outside of DC, our growing season is hot and wet. This is a problem because when you're supposed to be at your most productive with your fruits or vegetables or grains or hay, you have to contend with flooding and rot, in addition to pests and other environmental hazards. Having that nice dry growing season allows so much more leeway in being able to control factors of production and knowing that you have some relative safety from environmental damage out of your control. Mild winters make for further safety on either end of the growing season. You can plant earlier and harvest later. You can squeeze in an extra harvest, particularly of grains and hay, if you're not worried about the ground freezing and killing your crops. Obviously, this all has a big asterisk because there are areas of more extreme temperatures, both in alpine and arid climates in the country, but overall, the Iberian Peninsula as a whole is incredibly well suited to every kind of crop and livestock production. The mountain ranges and the Meseta, which is a large arid region in central Spain, play a big role as well. What they create is a series of rain shadow effects, in which one side of the mountain range is a desert area and the other is shielded from a lot of the harsh weather conditions present there. It makes for a very gentle and hospitable growing region. The mountains also make for a very effusive system of rivers. The major ones we pay attention to, particularly as it pertains to agriculture and irrigation, are the Ebro River, the Duero, and the Guadiana. The Ebro is located right up here, the Duero right over here, and the Guadiana right down here. Down in southern Spain, there is also the Guadalquivir right here, and its delta is a very fertile region where you see a lot of grapes. The other three, though, play a big role in many of the territorial disputes as well as the aqueduct and irrigation innovations. These innovations and influences on Spanish agriculture began under Rome. Rome and the aqueducts cannot be understated as really the first foray into agricultural technology in Spain. Agriculture and food was one of the major impetus for the conquering of Spain, to feed the Roman army and the Roman engine of empire. Once the definitely problematic conquering of the Iberian Peninsula was effectively complete, Rome leveraged infrastructure like aqueducts and other public works to incentivize assimilation of native populations and use them as a reward for successful assimilation into the Roman Empire. This practice was probably at its most successful in Spain, though it was practiced elsewhere. The aqueduct system laid the groundwork for so much of the later innovation to keep the water flowing, particularly from the three rivers we just mentioned, the Ebro, the Duero, and the Guadiana. All three of these rivers are in areas where if you don't have dams, if you don't have aqueducts, if you don't have irrigation, the amount of arable land decreases dramatically. But all three of these rivers are strong enough and have regular enough inflow from the mountain ranges that they are a very enduring source of water for farming. Water rights and watersheds in modern times are something that I don't want to get into here because, very much like in California, they can still be very messy. But the aqueduct system is still the foundation of water movement in Spain today. After Rome came the Visigoths, which is the next influence I want to discuss, and the fueros. The fueros started out not so much as an agricultural innovation, but as a political one. Fueros are land grants given by a monarchy. They were started under the Visigoths and greatly expanded under the rulers of Christian Spain during the centuries of Reconquista. The fueros themselves, or rather the documents, could cover anything from an individual householding to the crown of Castilla itself. The fueros helped establish a landed nobility in the Iberian Peninsula, but also served to tie people to the land itself as a way of life. Similar land grants represented a means of upward mobility for people of great skill or prowess like the caballeros, hidalgos, or letrados. As borders between Muslim and Christian Spain shifted, constant threats of war didn't make for areas hospitable to happy agriculture. You need time on the land to make agriculture work. If you are constantly moving or your land is constantly being damaged or destroyed by the activities of war, you don't really have the opportunity to develop agriculture or a food culture. And these fueros, what they did was give families a reason to go back to an agrarian lifestyle instead of further urbanization, and in doing so, furthering the cause of the Reconquista while establishing a culture of farming on the Iberian Peninsula. The Moors followed in 711, coming to the Iberian Peninsula via northern Africa and the Strait of Gibraltar. They brought with them not just their own technologies, but also the ability to improve on existing technologies in the form of more advanced mathematics and physics in a way that Rome had, but had never really explored as deeply. You see so much of their influence in Spanish food and agriculture down to the language that we use today. Most words you see in Spanish starting with AL are Arabic in origin, like almendra, almond. Others like naranja for orange, arroz for rice, or azafaran for saffron also come from Arabic roots. So many of the crops that we consider quintessentially Spanish were introduced by the Moors. They also brought water wheels, underground canals, cisterns, and hydraulic pumps, which greatly improved the existing aqueduct infrastructure in Spain and expanded it even further. On the other hand, even though we just spent all of this time talking about water innovation, Spain is also the perfect backdrop for a technique used extensively even today called dry farming. Dry farming relies on as little irrigation and water as you can possibly manage. While this sounds like it would be really challenging, certain crops thrive on it. Some grains, fruit, hay, and particularly wine grapes can and do thrive under this management style. For areas in Spain where irrigation is a challenge, even with all of the additional water infrastructure, still being able to grow crops makes a huge difference in the livelihoods of the people that live there. Dry farming is still used, particularly in wine grape production mundanely, as well as a growing contingent of pasture management for livestock. The last influence I want to talk about is the convivencia, which is the term for the coexistence of all three major religions in Spain: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. What we understand as the convivencia mundanely is in some way rose colored glasses. Many people refer to this as the golden age of Spain, where all three religions lived in harmony. That's not entirely true, in that there was always some amount of underlying tension, particularly as it pertained to Jews. There were places it was safer to be Jewish than others, and that often shifted it between Christian Spain and Muslim Spain. However, that also extends to Christians, Muslims, and converts to all three religions. But the long term coexistence of all three of these major religions brought a lot of academic development, and later in the 13th and 14th centuries, you see rewards being given to Muslims and Jews for their conversions in the way of professorships, as well as some of those land grants that we discussed previously. There were still a lot of forced conversions, but the knowledge of these diverse cultures was retained a lot more than it was elsewhere in Europe, where diaspora moments drove a lot of that knowledge out of the country. And Spain was able to capitalize on that for better and for worse. Trade routes. Spain has the distinct privilege of being at the end or at the source of a lot of different trade routes. If you want something from anywhere in the world, it was not that hard to get in Spain, particularly not once outward maritime exploration and colonialism really started taking hold. I have a whole other handout on that on my website, so I won't dig too deep in here right now, but the various sources of certain products, particularly where spices and other foodstuffs were concerned, you have access not to just continental Europe over the Pyrenees and via Italy, but also to the Middle East, the Silk Road, India, the Spice Islands, and to China. Whether via sea or land, there is very little in the world you cannot get in Spain in period, which means a ton of ingredient options and culinary influences if you have the means to take advantage of them. Another major influence to keep in mind in Spain is Catholicism and the role that Catholicism plays in everyday life. What you see here is a visual representation of the 365 days in a year and how many of them could be fast days. There are 189 potential fast days, and these aren't fasting in the way that many people understand it. I am Jewish, and for us, that generally means that we don't eat for anywhere from 12 to 25 hours. Whereas these are more fast days in that you don't eat red meat. But some red meats are okay because apparently goose is a fish. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the Catholic rules of fasting, but I do, however, have a great resource to recommend that I will add to the description. However, all this aside, knowing that diners in period have to work around these fast days greatly changes how you eat. So while half of the libro is dedicated to meat days, the latter half is all about fast days, and it is a lot of fish. It is a lot of very fun fish, because Spanish seafood is also legendary, and I highly recommend poking through it. It is a topic for a later class for me, but the major point is that this religious calendar does influence how people are going to be planning their food every single day. So now I want to talk about the recipes themselves. At this time, I have about 15 recipes that I have developed from this book. Some of them are still being refined, and I have more I'm working on. But what I really want to discuss for this section is how do you read NOLA and how do you work with these recipes? Reading NOLA and reading period recipes is incredibly fun for me and can be similar to recipes as we understand them mundanely. But there are a few things to keep an eye out for. So, what is the anatomy of a recipe in NOLA? It starts a couple of different ways. The first way we see here is what we would normally be comfortable seeing, just a list of ingredients. You'll see this in a lot of similar dishes to the one shown here, which is a spice blend for a spiced wine called clavea. These dishes may or may not include weights and measures or ratios of the ingredients. The second one you see a lot is serving size. This is included in a non-trivial amount of the recipes, but I don't have the exact numbers on what proportion. When he does note the serving size, it can be very helpful for scaling the dishes and figuring out where in a meal this dish might fit. Sometimes, though, it will just start with the first step of the recipe. This is a really fun way to start it, in that you're not, you have no idea what you're doing. You're just taken right off and figure out along the way what you may actually be making. So, my advice at this stage is kind of the stereotypical teacher advice. Read the whole question before you answer it. to figure out what it's really asking for. Nola is an unreliable narrator. You can't always trust his style of writing to adequately create one of his recipes. Next, he usually goes into preparation. This follows the pattern that we are largely used to seeing mundanely. How do you make the dish? It is generally fairly sequential in a step A leads to step B to step C kind of way, but we'll explore that more next. That brings us to the body of the recipe. And this is where you really have to be careful, because it is very clear that for all his talent in a kitchen, this man did not have anyone editing his work. There are quite a few recipes in which, halfway through the body of the recipe, he doubles back. The recipe shown here is one I'm still developing, because halfway through he starts saying, oh, by the way, in order to even get to this part, you need to have made an entire other dish. This recipe is for a cookie that is twice baked, but you have to start with a different cookie that Nola does not give you a recipe for, that you're then turning into cookie butter effectively, then rolling that into the other cookie dough. But he doesn't tell you any of that until you're halfway through the text of this recipe. Which leads me back to my original advice. Read each recipe through in entirety as if you were reading a test question in school, because sometimes he will trick you. Serving is another interesting topic. If Nola is going to mention how he likes it served, it's usually at the end of the recipe. It will not always be there, and very often it's quick mentions right before something is supposed to go to the table. Occasionally, he does bury the lead here, and it will also include the number of servings at this late stage of the recipe as well. Generally, when I'm referring to serving, I'm referring to plating instructions and garnishes. Of the 240 odd recipes in this book, 37% of them include plating instructions. And unlike what we would modernly consider garnishes, they're not just to make things pretty. Often, this garnish is that finishing touch that really ties the recipe together. Cinnamon sugar is by far the most common, but pot grease, additional cheese or herbs, and rose water are also very common. I have found in the recipes where this is mentioned, leaving it out often makes the recipe feel incomplete. So don't just brush these off as last minute things, because they really do contribute to the dish, even if it feels weird to throw cinnamon sugar on everything. If there is one thing I have learned from this book, it's that a little cinnamon sugar goes way further than most of us think that it will. Nola does sometimes like to include variations to his recipes because who doesn't? He'll do different flavor combinations or show you that different base ingredients behave similarly to the main inclusions. It's very common with the fish dishes in particular. But because he is still cooking for a royal household, some of the variations do include the fancy bits. You'll see recipes that say if you wish to make them royal, or in this way, you might serve it to a king or a lord. His last variation is how do you make this dish for sick people? Now, the vast majority of the dishes for sick people are take a thing that should not be mushy, make it mushy, and then add some almond milk. And I'm not going to lie, I have not tried out any of those, and I have no current plans to. But this trend does tend to be Nola's go-to method when somebody is sick. Make them some porridge. And who can blame him? It works. This is not a full and complete list, but here are some of the pictures of the redactions I have worked on out of the Libro. The eggplant dish on the left, berenjenas en cazuela, is one of my favorites because it also ties in my other major area of interest, Judaism in Spain. Professor Helene Jaua Pinier out of the University of Tours has a fantastic book on Sephardic cooking in Spain, and this dish has two of the hallmarks she identifies as quintessentially Sephardic: eggplants and cilantro. When you see recipes in the Libro with eggplants and cilantro, it is very likely that this is either a Sephardic recipe or Sephardic in origin. Little Easter eggs like that of the cooking influences is one of the things that makes this book such a fascinating study subject. In the middle is a pine nut sauce over a barded roast chicken, but honestly, I love the sauce so much I just eat it by the spoonful. This combo is a little fancier, but in the next photo, you'll see one of his homier dishes. This one is a savory bread pudding with roasted chicken and bacon. I use duck bacon in my recipe, and it is to die for. I highly recommend starting with the spice mixes, though. Not only is it a great way to get to know Nola's writing style, it is a great base for how Nola's flavor profiles work. You'll need some of the stuff that can be a little harder to find, like grains of paradise and long pepper, but the blends make for an excellent introduction to the book. The Duke's powder, in particular, has become a staple of my everyday cooking, not just my SCA cooking. Thank you so much for joining me in this discussion. If there are any questions I can answer for you, please feel free to reach out to me via email, my website, or on social media, and I am always happy to chat. Thank you again.